Okay, we're going to talk about verb tense shifts, and you guys are going to have to bear with me because the lighting and the camera and the trying to explain stuff using this teeny tiny whiteboard that I rescued from my garage is not the easiest. So, these are not ideal conditions under which to teach and under which to learn. So, we're just going to have to roll with it. Hopefully, we will be Zooming for our next class period, but for this one, I just decided to do this instead while we kind of get acclimated. So let's talk about tense shifts, because the reading that you guys have, the Owl at Purdue reading, the Google Doc that I linked, that's really important, and you really need to pay careful attention and read that well. You're going to have a paragraph in the next exam where you're going to have to identify all the verbs and then the tense shifts, and then tell me if the tense shifts are correct or incorrect. And the homework that you're going to do is going to kind of prepare you for that. So you're going to look at sentences that have a tense shift in them, and you're going to tell me if that tense shift is correct or not. So how do we determine whether or not a tense shift is correct or incorrect? Well, the Owl at Purdue, page I linked, which is just I copied and pasted and then linked it. It is very, I think, easy to follow and detailed. So it gives a lot of good examples about when shifts are appropriate and when they're not. But this example that I have here is one that I see a lot. And so if you're getting told by your professor that you're shifting tenses and, that's not good, and a lot of times it's not good, it's not appropriate, it's not grammatically correct, then this is probably what is happening. So this is not taken from any specific student paper, but I see this constantly. So the student is writing, and the student says, they're talking about, they're paraphrasing and then quoting, right, from a short story called The Story of an Hour. And the student writes, Mrs. Mallard said, free, body and soul free, and then looks out of the window, right? Okay, so you can hear that shift, right? Let's identify the verbs first. So the verbs here are said, right, and looks, right? Okay, so we can tell that these are two different tenses, right? This is past tense, and this is, I should probably write it because they're both. That's past, and this one is present, right? Okay. And so we go from the past tense right here to the present tense here without really any kind of explanation for that shift. The action doesn't take place at two different times, right? If Mrs. Mallard said, then Mrs. Mallard needs to looked, right? She looked out the window. She didn't looks out the window. But this is kind of incorrect here and not here. And it's because when we're analyzing literature, or when we're just analyzing or critically arguing, or really writing about literature, or any kind of evaluation, we always use the present tense. And so it needs to be Mrs. Mallard says, okay, free, body and soul free, and then looks out the window. That's what it needs to be, because it should be in present tense. So when do we use past tense when we're writing? Well, we use past tense when we're writing if we're talking about an author's ideas or work as a historical thing, right? Something that happened. But literature and, I'm trying to think for ed majors what you're going to be writing most about. I guess processes and like kind of case study type things, right? So I don't know exactly how APA wants to handle that, but I do know that when we're writing about evaluations and when we're writing analyses and when we're writing about literature, we always use the present tense, and the things that are happening in the story are always happening in the present tense. And the author is always writing. Or writes. So we would say Chopin writes and then give a quote. Not Chopin wrote or Chopin said. It's writes. Chopin is the author of this work, Kate Chopin. So we always want to use the present tense for those things. We want to use the present tense for literature. So generally, when you'll shift in an essay is in the beginning of the essay when you're talking about, like when you're establishing background information about the literature that you're going to be talking about. And then you'll shift from that intro into present tense when you're actually analyzing and looking at the literature. The same thing will probably happen if you're looking at data, right? So as you're looking at the data or as you're examining the data throughout the body of the essay, then you will be using the present tense, right? But in the intro and then maybe even in the conclusion, you'll be using a different tense. Now, sometimes in a case study or something that evaluates data, at the end there is there's kind of a call to action. So it's like further studies are needed to to trace the efficacy of blah blah blah. But notice how you're in present tense there. Sometimes you'll use even a future tense, right? Will, or we expect this data will show blank 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 blank. So it just really depends. It's a pretty natural thing, I think, for us to understand. But you just have to be aware that if you are using one predominant tense, either past or present, in your writing, your shifts need to be appropriate to that tense. So as the OWL handout shows, some of the tenses, right, if you're in present, you'll go past progressive, past perfect progressive, right? And that's like a normal shift. But to just suddenly go from present to past tense normally isn't something that we would do. And some things are written in present tense. A lot of works are written in past tense. So the Harry Potter books are written in past tense predominantly. There's shifts in tense there, but it's Harry looked, Harry said, Harry, right? The Hunger Games is present tense primarily. And I think Twilight is too. But I don't know. It's been a long time since I read Twilight, but I'm pretty sure it is. So a lot of young adult fiction is written in the present tense to give it a sense of urgency, to give it a sense of action, right? Like, ooh, what's going to happen next? And this is all happening in real time. And that's why they're also written in first person, because it helps young, more immature readers get engrossed in the narrative. So that's the reason that some young adult books especially, and some action books too, are written in present tense. But most of the time, literature is written in past tense. Okay, so yeah. So my advice basically is, since I can't really field questions from you right now, my advice is to read the OWL handout really carefully. So make sure that you're reading and paying close attention to what's going on, and take stops if you need to. Like if you feel like you're getting overwhelmed reading a paragraph about tense shifts, then just hang out for a minute, give your brain some time to process, and then reread that paragraph. I have to reread things several times before they make sense sometimes, and that's not a mark of you're a slow learner or you're not a very good learner or you're stupid. It's that you're a human and your brain has to absorb things, especially things that you're not used to reading or learning about. So that is the tense shifts. And now I'm going to talk about modal verbs, even though I already kind of talked about